I'm going to do something a little unusual. I'm going to see if I can show how, in really rapid, condensed form, the sciences are unifying, and that's how you could go from physics to biology to psychology to economics. And economics is not something floating around unconnected to everything else, but that it's all one unified system of knowledge now, okay, or soon. A basic principle of physics is the idea of entropy, second law of thermodynamics, that all organized systems tend to, over time, go towards disorder and chaos. So that chaos, randomness, something far away from a desirable outcome is the natural state of things. So all organisms start in extreme poverty, and everything they have is something that they produce with effort. And whereas our assumption, since natural selection has populated the world with, over time with organisms which are highly organized, we sort of think that that all comes for free, but it's not. That there's always has to be some process which moves you from a state of order, a state of disorder towards order. Wherever you find order, and there's most of the universe, you find almost no order. So if you go to the moon, it's the same age as the Earth, but the most interesting thing there is piles of rubble or rock, right? Whereas you walk around on Earth and there's this huge effusion of life forms, right? And that's because on Earth, there was a physical system at some point which by accident was highly enough organized that it could make copies of itself, a little membrane, say, in the ocean that then fixed other chemicals into the membrane and then budded off or something. So you get an initial replicator, and once you get an initial replicator, you get natural selection. That is, randomness comes for free in entropy, and so mutations are always occurring, and the great majority of them are going to increase disorder, and they're unfavorable, and those interfere with the organism's reproduction, and they disappear. But every once in a while, a mutation comes along which improves the organism's organization for reproduction, and then that leads to a higher rate of reproduction, and then that naturally spreads. And so we're descended from that initial organism, and all the species are continually proliferating into lots of realms of high order. Is a process of natural selection is something that pushes things uphill against the natural tendency towards increasing disorder. And then there's a couple other things which, once you have organisms, which can create increases in order. And we'll talk about markets, with individuals choosing better outcomes from each other over worse outcomes, and that can push things towards more and more mutual welfare. And then the third thing is intelligent design, such as humans designing a computer or a chicken coop, or they're imposing a functional order where previously there was disorder, something more valuable because we can represent it and then choose the better, right? Sometimes engineers make mistakes and airplanes crash, but still on average, it's better, okay? So life is filtered every generation to embody functional organization that leads the organism to make choices of those things that better position the organism for reproduction over things that lead to worse outcomes. So that getting food as opposed to things that are less nutritious, or getting shelter, or the ability to make choices that improve the organism's situation, right? And after 4 billion years of relentless selection for machinery in each organism to make better choices, right? To value something that's better for the organism over what's worse for the organism, that means that we're aesthetic beings, right? We have this feeling of we want what we experience are individually judged to be good, right? So natural selection produces valuing organisms, and but there's a problem, which is that we're radically ignorant. So we think we look out and see the world and we see reality and so on, but this is, as cognitive scientists have discovered, is a big mistake. So a very gifted scientist we had postdocs with, he used to say that perception is externally driven hallucination. That is, that we think that sometimes we're hallucinating, maybe we're drunk or we've taken a drug or we're crazy, but normally we see what's really there, and then we're not hallucinating. But the reality is we're always hallucinating, but sometimes we're hallucinating things that are actually there. And rarely, because natural selection tries to minimize this, we hallucinate things that aren't there, right? And so that's why optical illusions work. You can see things that are not happening, okay, if you trick the perceptual system. And so all we really know, or all we really experience, is something in our immediate local environment, right? And so there's a whole world of people and all these things out there, and we don't know anything about it, right? So if we're going to make choices and yet we're ignorant, there's a problem, right? So how do you make economies work when the individual players are highly ignorant, right? And if you take even a really smart person who you'll call an expert or an authority, how should the economy be run, right? They don't know enough. They don't know all the different individuals with all their different needs and all their different abilities to contribute, right? So you can't run it from a top-down way because no set of individuals is smart enough to run the economy. So given a world of billions and our massive ignorance, how can we hope to choose out of the immense number of possible alternative sets of possible economies, which one will move us away from chaos and towards things that produce value for the participants, right? How, as opposed to economies that increase entropy and that, like Venezuela, are collapsing, right? And also then people criticize, profit seeking as a bad thing, right? And I just want to point out what is profit. All organisms are designed to choose the things which bring them more value at a cost which is less. They're sacrificing less than what they get, so more for less. And those that spend more to get less, they go extinct, right? And farmers and their families that plant more grain than they end up harvesting, they starve. And the hunter-gatherer that spends more calories in foraging for food than they get, they starve, right? So profit is just another word that all organisms have as a sort of implicit organizing goal for getting more for less, right? And that's a good thing. That's not a bad thing. The bad reputation comes when when people are in situations where they get more at the expense of somebody else, right? And so that's why it has a bad reputation. But that only comes from some interactions, right? So all organisms, even socialists, right, seek profit. They seek to realize more of their values than they cost themselves in the pursuit of those values. So it's not that capitalists are profit-seeking and socialists aren't, okay? Everybody, all organism, the lowliest organism, okay, is profit-seeking. Also, each individual is inclined towards making the best choices out of those that the organism know that they correctly understand and are being offered to them, right? So this doesn't get us very far, though, since it collides with the principle of entropy or ignorance, right? How do you know what's a good offer, what's not a good offer? Moreover, it's common that outcomes that realize values of one individual decrease the values realized by another, right? So we come from an evolutionary history where we can cooperate and give benefit for benefit, but that's a kind of newly emerging thing in humans. Most other animals don't engage in cooperative exchange very much. And so when they interact and they want to get a benefit, they do it by threatening to harm. The offer is, I will hurt you unless you relinquish the resource to me, right? Okay, so that's the logic of animal conflict. It's aggression, right? And we have that evolutionary history too. And so we have that set of instincts which allows us to interact with each other in that way, to value being dominant, being tough, so if you're tough and aggressive, then people won't harass you, right? And you can also, they'll maybe be biased towards you in not, because they don't want to, offend you, right? Anyway, but interactions can be better for one party, worse for the other, right? So win-lose, or they can be worse for both, lose-lose, and like World War II, right? Or they can be better for both, win-win, right? And so, we have these two tools of social negotiation: helping, in order to induce somebody to give you something that you want, you can offer to help them in exchange, or you can threaten them with harm, and then the benefit they derive is, so the threat extortion is, to induce you to give me something I value, I can offer you a choice between two outcomes. Give me what I want, or I will hurt you, make you worse off. And so if that's the true state of affairs, you will want to not be made worse off, so you will yield your labor or the resource, or, if you're a peasant, you give it to your feudal lord who can kill you, right? So that's one way humans deal with each other. And here the average welfare across the interaction is negative, right? And also there's almost no limit to how highly negative it could be, because for the dominant individuals who want to engage in it, all they need to do is to be made better off, regardless of the cost. So they may take the food and leave the other person to starve, right? And so if you allow threats, force, to be a tool of social negotiation, average welfare decreases, right? And it rewards what kind of, if you have a world in which people can extort from each other, what does that incentivize? What skills does that incentivize people to cultivate? Well, they cultivate the tools of hurting, of aggression. They become more skillful warriors, because the more harm you can threaten to inflict on other people, the more you can get. So you have the emergence of, say, special classes of people who specialize in warfare. And we call these aristocrats, sort of, the medieval aristocrat, emerge in all stratified societies around the world. And they try to monopolize the use of weapons and so on. And they then trade I won't kill you peasants if you give us taxes, right? Then the other choice of social negotiation is conditional helping. Give me what I value, and I will give you something you value more, right? I will make you better off if you make me better off, right? Or two, if you choose not to do that, then I'll leave you as you are. And no worse off than before, but worse off than you could have been if you'd accepted my offer of getting something you benefit, you get more, okay? And so if the exchange happens, both parties are judging, it's a test, both parties are judging that they're made better off by this interaction. And if one of them says, I'm not being made better off, I'm not going to do this, then the exchange doesn't happen. So it just leaves people in the previous state, right? So exchange necessarily makes people on average better off. Both parties win. It's a win-win. And exchange then also incentivizes the cultivation of ever-increasing skills or abilities to deliver benefits to the other party. Because the more value you have to offer to other people, the more you can get in exchange. And so, in that sense, virtue is rewarded, that your ability to help people, to be a doctor or whatever it is, or to develop a machine, or just to work in a reliable way, and to deliver a benefit. Those are benefit interactions, right? Okay, so Adam Smith argued that the system of natural liberty, which is often called capitalism, that value realization, which is just what we mean by wealth is not physical objects. It can include often does include physical objects, but includes services and all sorts of other. If you want to have time to meditate or reach spiritual heights, well, you need to eat, and so you do something beneficial for the others, and you get something in exchange. Okay, so where individuals are free to choose the best, most value realizing among all the offers they could potentially have, and in turn is free to choose to offer any offer to anybody without interference from other parties, then this is, you're incentivized to seek out somebody who what you have to offer is worth the most to, right? Because then this system of natural liberty inevitably it's a filter of all the different possible economies. It filters for benefit interactions. And as time passes and skills get better and more complex ways of networks of exchange and so on emerge, people get wealthier and wealthier. And so instead of in a harm world, things are zero sum or negative sum, right? And so then if somebody is wealthy, like the feudal lord, they got that by extorting others. So they took zero sum, they took from others, and wealth is a sign of the amount of threat they initiated. Okay, and on the other hand, in societies with natural liberty, wealth flows towards those who, value realization flows to everybody, but it flows more to people who find ways of benefiting other people more, right? 1 minute. Okay, so I just want to say that these two ways of interacting, there's lots of different instincts that people have, like loving your child and so on, but those they only extend to an individual or two individuals or something. They're very short range, right? But markets can scale up, right? So that people can exchange, and they lose sight of all the different participants ultimately, and the other thing is that extortion can scale up too. So empires, exploitive empires are things that can scale up in hierarchy. You can be sucked into a hierarchy of threat, right? There's a wonderful children's book called The Wizard of Earthsea, written by Ursula Le Guin back in the 1960s. And in this world, magic works that individuals with the natural ability to cast spells, they can only affect magically things they can describe perfectly and that they know all about, right? And this is described as being a very good thing, because if you could make a spell that was of anything, right, then there would be no limits to the consequences as it radiated out, and that everybody would be causing harm to everybody else accidentally or intentionally. And so I was thinking that was a good analogy for private property, that private property is just a word, it's a phrase for something that by agreement you are given the right to control and dispose of, right? And so your apartment, your backpack, the food on your shelf. Those are things you know well, right? So you don't have to know everything in the economy to make a good choice. You just have to hear if somebody makes you an offer. You have to know what the offer is, and then you have to know what you have and whether it's worthwhile to you. So it's a very local thing that then filters for a benefit interaction, right? So most people think of private property as what allows rich people to sit on a heap of stuff, right, and keep it away from other people. But instead, it's this, you control something you know about, and therefore you can make a good judgment about whether to accept or not accept an offer, right? Just like the magic, you can have a spell because you can describe the thing completely. You know about it, right? And so this is Hayek's point about local knowledge and the distribution of knowledge, that no expert, no professor knows enough to run the economy because they don't know all the billions of people and all the individual values, right? And so people use that as an argument to become a dictator, to say, allow me to use force and I will make things better. But then with our instincts for liking power and using power exploitatively, that opens the door for descent into Venezuela today.
Let me tell you where I'm going to go from here. What I'm going to argue is that our evolved intuitions shape cultural transmission about economics and public policy, and that to change minds, you need to understand something about the design of the mind. So a very common view is that instincts are the opposite of reasoning. And a lot of people think that evolution erased all of our instincts and replaced them with reasoning. They don't say what kind of reasoning. Is it logical reasoning? Is it probability theory? Is it the Savage axioms? What kind of reasoning usually is not specified. But instincts are not the opposite of reasoning. Evolutionary psychologists are finding programs governing inference with the following properties. They're complexly specialized for solving an adaptive problem. They reliably develop in all normal human beings. They develop without any conscious effort. They develop without formal instruction. You don't need to be, nobody needs to teach you these things. They're applied without any awareness of their underlying logic. And they're distinct from more general abilities to process information or behave intelligently. These are all the hallmarks that we usually associate with an instinct. But these are little circuits that govern reasoning. They make certain inferences as easy and effortless and natural to us as humans as spinning a web is to a spider or building a dam is to a beaver. They're reasoning instincts. They're specializations. They're like on your cell phone, you've got all these apps that are each one specialized for a different function. We have reasoning mechanisms, different ones, specialized for different functions. And they structure our thoughts so powerfully that we're usually unaware that they exist until they're broken. So I want to give you a very small example before I go to cooperation and exchange and so on. This is called the Charlie task. It was developed by Simon Baron-Cohen, who studies theory of mind. And if you ask any 4-year-old, you say, this is my friend Charlie. You say, which candy does Charlie want? Any typically developing 4-year-old will say, he wants this one. That seems obvious, right? That seems like the sort of thing that some sort of general learning system could learn by everyday experience, right? But if you ask a person with autism that same question, which candy does Charlie want? Their answers are random. They might choose all of them. They might choose any one of these. They just answer randomly. But, and this is the key thing, if you ask them which candy is Charlie looking at, the person with autism will say, this one. So they know exactly they have the information. They know what candy Charlie is looking at. But they don't use that information to make an inference about what Charlie wants, which is a mental state. It's one of the problems in autism. It's a very specific kind of problem. That's a little circuit governing reasoning, and it's a kind of circuit that we don't realize even exists because people with autism can learn all kinds of things. It's not that they can't learn other things, but they don't do this. This very simple, straightforward kind of automatic, effortless inference that we all make. We often don't realize these exist until they're either broken, as in a disorder, or until we realize that another species doesn't make the same inference, or sometimes till we try to program a robot or an artificial intelligence system to make the same inference. Sometimes it takes one of those things to realize, oh my God, there's something really here to explain. Okay, so let's go to Adam Smith for a second. He wondered something. He wondered whether the human propensity to truck, barter, and exchange one thing for another is one of those original principles in human nature, or the necessary consequence of the faculties of reason and speech. And there's now an answer. It's human nature. It turns out that the mind has evolved programs, which you can think of as reasoning instincts, that are specialized for making inferences about social exchange, about reciprocation, about trade, basically. And this is something we've been studying for one of the things we've been studying for many years. There's an evolved program functionally specialized for reasoning about social exchange, and it includes which you can think of as a subroutine for detecting cheaters, individuals who take benefits without ever reciprocating. And this is a neurocognitive system that reliably develops in the human cognitive architecture in a species-typical manner. It's one component of human nature. And it's the cognitive foundation of trade. So I want to give you a very quick example, because it would take over an hour for me to show you the array of evidence. I want to compare logical reasoning versus cheater detection for a second. And I'm going to show it to you so you can experience the phenomenon yourself. So logical reasoning, or let's say, are people good at looking for black swans? So Karl Popper, philosopher of science, he had proposed a normative standard for evaluating hypotheses, where the hypothesis is expressed as a conditional rule of the form if P then Q. And he said, so for example, if a bird is a swan, then it's white. He pointed out that, look, no number of white swans can prove that this is true, but one black swan proves it false. So Popper said scientists should use logic. If P then Q logically implies that there are no cases in which P is true and Q is false. No cases of P and not Q. That is, there are no swans that are not white. So he said, look for logical violations. Don't look for confirmation, look for logical violations. Well, whatever you may think of that as a philosophy of science, we can ask the question, is everyday learning like this? Are people good at looking for logical violations of hypotheses? More generally, are we good at looking for cases that could violate a conditional rule, a rule of the form if P then Q? So cognitive psychologists ask this question by using a very standard tool, Peter Wason's 4-card selection task, and I'm going to show it to you right now. So I want you to experience this for yourself. So it's describing that there's this disease, Ebbinghaus disease. I made up this disease. And people are trying to understand it, and there's an assembly of people trying to understand Ebbinghaus disease because it's complicated with its symptoms and so forth. And so patients afflicted with Ebbinghaus disease have many different symptoms: nosebleeds, headaches, ringing in the ears, and others. Diagnosing it is difficult because a patient may have the disease, yet not manifest all of the symptoms. Dr. Buchner, an expert on the disease, said that the following rule holds: if a person has Ebbinghaus disease, then that person will be forgetful. Dr. Buchner may be wrong, however. You're interested in seeing whether there are any patients whose symptoms violate this rule. The cards below represent 4 patients in your hospital. Each card represents one patient. One side of the card tells whether or not the patient has Ebbinghaus disease, and the other side tells whether or not that patient is forgetful. Which of the following card or cards would you definitely need to turn over to see if any of these cases violate Dr. Buchner's rule? If a person has Ebbinghaus disease, then that person will be forgetful. Don't turn over any more cards than are absolutely necessary. So first, would you need to turn this one over? Yeah. Because if this patient it says he has Ebbinghaus disease, if he were not forgetful, that would be a case that violates the rule. That would be a black swan. You don't really need to turn over this one, because it doesn't say that the only people who are forgetful are people who have Ebbinghaus disease. It could have Alzheimer's disease and be forgetful. You could be my age and you could be forgetful. There's lots of causes of being forgetful. So you don't have to turn over this card. This card, this is somebody who's forgetful. Do you need to turn that over to see if that violates the rule? No, right. Because it could say Alzheimer's disease. It could say anything else on it, and that wouldn't violate the rule. What about this one right here? Do you need to see what's on the other side of this? Yes, because this is the other part of the black swan. This is the black part, and equivalent to the swan on the other side. If this guy, who is not forgetful, has Ebbinghaus disease, that would violate the rule, because the rule is violated only by cases where somebody has Ebbinghaus disease and is not forgetful. So, in general, this is a rule of the form if P then Q. The complete logically correct answer is to choose the P card. Since it can only be violated by P and not Q when P is true and Q is false, you need to look at the P card to see if there's a not Q on the back, so if he's not forgetful. And you need to look at the not Q card to see if he has Ebbinghaus disease in this case. That is not what most people do. Most people a lot of people will pick this card. They'll realize that's necessary. A lot of people will not choose this card, and a number of people will choose this card. And in fact, the number of people who choose only P, not Q, and no other card, it's only about 26% of, say, college students. So that does not make us the poster child for logical reasoning as humans, right? That's not looking for falsifying cases. Now, even if you understood this right away, if you didn't see it right away, that just means you have a human mind. Try this one and see how, well, I'll show you in a second. The question is, are people always bad at looking for violations of conditional rules? The huge body of research shows that, yes, they're always bad at looking for violations of conditional rules when that rule is indicative. That is when it describes the world, like a disease causing a symptom. Even when it's familiar to them. So the idea of a disease causing a symptom is perfectly familiar to people, but they're not good at looking for violations of a rule like that. So you can ask now, what happens when we change the content of that conditional rule so that it's about social exchange? Are we good at looking for violations when violations would reveal cheaters? We should be if there are programs in the head that are specialized for regulating social exchange. So using that same standard tool for investigating conditional reasoning, this Wason 4-card selection task, we asked whether people are good at reasoning about social exchange. So now try this. Teenagers who don't have their own cars usually end up borrowing their parents' cars. In return for the privilege of borrowing the car, the Goldsteins have given their kids the rule, if you borrow my car, then you have to fill up the tank with gas. Of course, teenagers are sometimes careless and irresponsible. You're interested in seeing whether any of the Goldstein teenagers broke this rule. The cards below represent 4 of the Goldstein teenagers. Each card represents one teenager. One side of the card tells whether or not a teenager has borrowed their parents' car on a particular day, and the other side tells whether or not that teenager filled up the tank with gas on that day. Which of the following card or cards would you definitely need to turn over to see if any of these teenagers are breaking their parents' rule? If you borrow my car, then you have to fill up the tank with gas. Don't turn over any more cards than are absolutely necessary. Do you have to check the teenager who borrowed the car? Yeah, I'll see. What about this one who didn't borrow the car? No, because, I mean, they might be altruistic and nice to their parents and fill up the tank anyway, but they can't have broken the rule. What about the guy who filled up the tank with gas? Do you need to check him out? No. Whether he borrowed the car or not doesn't matter. He fulfilled that requirement. What about the guy who did not fill up the tank with gas? Do you need to check him out? Yes, you need to see whether he borrowed the car. Basically, this rule also has a form if P then Q, and borrow the car is the P card, not filling the tank with gas is a not Q card, and now the number of people who choose P, not Q, and no other cards is 76%. 3 times as many people give the logically correct answer when it's a social this is a social contract. It has the form, if you take the benefit, then you have to meet my requirement. It's not that people are reasoning, it's not that social contracts activate logical reasoning, it activates a procedure for detecting cheaters. Because I can create a rule in which the logically correct answer is not the correct answer if you're designed to detect cheaters, and people detect cheaters, even if that's not a violation of first-order logic, for example. So the claim is that how the mind sees that problem is like this. The mind is translating social contracts, rules of the form, if you take the benefit, then you have to pay my cost or meet my requirement, into representations of benefits and requirements, and it inserts concepts such as entitled to and obligated to, whether they're specified or not. So when you hear a rule like, if you borrow my car, then you have to fill up the tank with gas, it's translated into your head as, if you take the benefit, then you're obligated to satisfy the requirement. There's other inferences like, if you satisfy the requirement, then you're entitled to take the benefit, and so on. It has its own logic to it. And the claim is that what happens is it activates look for cheaters routine that looks for people who accepted the benefit and who did not satisfy the requirement, because those are potential cheaters that you have to look for. If you have natural selection can only support programs for regulating cooperation if it's conditional. If you cooperate with other cooperators and you withdraw cooperation from cheaters and you defect on cheaters. We probably had tit for tat and things, a little bit of game theory in economics. So notice that this is of the form if P then Q. This happens to be the P card. This happens to be the not Q card. And that's why people are suddenly looking like they're paragons of logic here. But it's not because it's activating logic. For many experiments, we've shown that it's activating a logic specific to social exchange, inferences about social exchange. So we may be bad logicians, but we excel at looking for violations of conditional rules when those express an agreement to exchange. Abstractly, what has the form, if you want benefit B from me, then you must satisfy my requirement R. And when the search for violations would reveal potential cheaters. That is, individuals who accepted the benefit offered without satisfying the other person's requirement and did so on purpose. So the mechanism doesn't look for innocent mistakes, it looks for cheaters. So we spent a lot of time, many years, testing against alternative hypotheses to explain these results. We went in search of this. This wasn't something that was known before we started. We had the hypothesis from evolutionary biology, from the evolution of reciprocal altruism, from the game theory simulations of tit for tat and things like this. So we knew that you can't get adaptations for exchange to evolve unless you're good at looking for cheaters. So we went in search of this mechanism. And we found that reasoning about social exchange is regulated by evolved programs that are very, very specialized for this function. And what design features does this evolved system has? It has a lot, and let me just, without giving you all the evidence, let me just say that there is a subroutine that looks for cheaters. It does not look for people who made innocent mistakes. And it doesn't look for people who violate other kinds of social norms. It's specific to social exchange. It works even for unfamiliar social exchange rules. I can give you a rule like if a man eats cassava root, then he must have a tattoo on his face. And I can set it in some fictitious culture. And if I tell you that the cassava root's a benefit and that it's regulated, you have to meet this requirement in order to get the benefit, you will still detect cheaters very well. You don't have to be familiar with the situation as it should be, because you need to understand every new opportunity to exchange as it comes up. It won't do to just understand the last thing you did and not understand the future opportunities. The inferences are content-rich and specialized for exchange with concepts of entitlement and obligation and so forth. The procedures operate on benefits and costs. If I take a benefit out of this, if it's a rule that sounds otherwise the same, but it doesn't regulate access to a benefit, people don't do well on it. It looks for cheaters from both perspectives equally well. It reliably develops cross-culturally, and it's neurally dissociable from other kinds of reasoning. You can knock out, brain damage can knock out a person's ability to detect cheaters while preserving their ability to solve other kinds of problems that are very, very similar. Now, if this were the only evolved mechanism for reasoning about cooperation for mutual benefit, it would be very easy to convince people, or I think maybe it would be, maybe it wouldn't be, easy to convince people that free market policies make people better off. So the question then becomes why do people support socialism after they see Venezuela and all the failures? The number of times it's failed is astonishing around the world. And I would argue that it's because the social exchange reasoning system is not the only evolved program in our heads that regulates cooperation for mutual benefit. There are at least 3 evolved systems regulating cooperation. There's the one I just described that's more for 2-person cooperation. There's risk pooling and sharing. And then there's cooperating in larger groups, collective actions. And these other 2 systems regulating cooperation can make socialism seem very intuitive and appealing to some people, despite the many cases, falsifying cases, where it's making people miserable. So each of you could think of these as 3 different apps for cooperation with different properties and activated by different circumstances. Each of them is activated by different conditions and generates different intuitions about what to do and what's fair. Ones that are well designed for solving a specific adaptive problem faced by our hunter-gatherer ancestors. And these evolved intuitions shape our thought with effects on the cultural transmission of ideas, which ideas go easily from mind to mind and which don't. The problem is that intuitions that evolve for a small-scale social world shape how people think about issues now, even in complex economies where you often can't predict. So think about it this way, that the past explains the present. So what is hunter-gatherer life really like? And what problems involving cooperation did our ancestors face? Well, what did Karl Marx believe? He believed that the existing extant hunter-gatherers, and by extension our ancestors, lived in a state of primitive communism, where all labor was accomplished through collective action, And sharing was governed by the decision rule, from each according to his ability to each according to his need. He thought the overthrow of capitalism would bring forth an economically advanced society with similar properties, that if you just abolish private property, all labor is going to once again be accomplished through collective action, and because the mind reflects the material conditions of existence, the hunter-gatherer communal sharing rule will emerge once again and dominate social life. Based on his theory, as you know, in the 20th century, institutions and laws governing property, the organization, compensation of labor, everything were changed across the planet in all of these utopias. So it had a profound impact on the lives of the citizens of these nations, although they were not the utopian ones that Marx had envisioned. So we can ask, was Marx right? Was his view of hunter-gatherer labor and sharing rules correct? And if not, what cognitive programs regarding cooperation did the selection pressures endemic to hunter-gatherer life build? Well, hunter-gatherer life is very cooperative. There's a lot of cooperation among hunter-gatherers, but it's not an orgy of indiscriminate cooperation. There are several alternative sharing rules, even within the same cultural group. And the triggers for two of these alternative rules, sharing rules, two of these apps, are the perception of variance due to luck versus effort. So when hunter-gatherers, when they hunt, hunting is a very risky business. There's been many studies of existing hunter-gatherers, and when you go on a hunt, men will go on a hunt, and they will often, half the time, they'll come back with nothing, okay? So there's a problem, which is you don't have a refrigerator to store meat for the future, right? What hunter-gatherers do is they store meat in the form of social obligations. They share meat very widely in their band. It's closest to the sharing rule, from each according to his ability to each according to his need. It's insurance. It's a risk pool. They create a risk pool. Gathered foods, when you're gathering fruit or nuts or berries, the variance in outcome is pretty low, and what variance exists is due to effort. I'll have more fruit if I spend more time foraging. Not because it's not usually due to luck. It's more effort. And for gathered foods, they don't share at the band-wide level. Those they share within their family, and they share via reciprocation, through exchange with particular friends that they have a relationship with. And some goods they have explicit trade sometimes, although more when it's with people from other bands. So there seems to be a Q-activated program for risk pooling. Is this particular situation we're in right now, is bad luck causing reversals of fortune or not? So cues of luck, of good luck and bad luck, they activate the same hunter-gatherer society in so-called weird cultures, Western, educated, industrial, rich, democratic. You can do experiments in Japan and the United States with college students, and they behave the same way as hunter-gatherers. When they get a windfall, how many of you know the dictator game? Okay, doesn't matter. If you get a windfall of money from the experimenter due to luck, then they're more likely to share it, and they're more likely to demand shares from the unlucky are more likely to demand shares from the lucky to ask for redistribution. On the other hand, if the experimenter has a person exert effort to get the money that they can then divide if they want, people don't share it the same way. They'll share maybe half, they'll share more than rational analysis predicts, more than a Homo economicus model will predict, when they got it by a windfall, but not when they got it by effort. Let me just go further. So it's as if we have a grammar of sharing in our heads. So the first two of these sound like normal human sharing rule. If he's a victim of an unlucky tragedy, then we should pitch in to help him out. Sounds perfectly normal. Or if he spends his time loafing and living off of others, then he doesn't deserve our help. Those sound pretty normal. But these sound very, very weird for our species, and probably it would be for any species. If he's a victim of an unlucky tragedy, then he doesn't deserve our help. That's kind of weird. It's an odd rule. Or if I have the asterisks because they're sort of socially ungrammatical, or if he spends his time loafing and living off of others, then we should all pitch in to help him out. That also sounds kind of weird. Doesn't sound like a human sharing rule. So this risk-pooling psychology shapes debate now over political issues and policy issues. When whenever something seems to involve high variance due to luck, this band-wide sharing rule, it seems good and proper and fair. And cultural transmission is shaped by these sharing rules. So if you think about it, in the United States, there were political debates about homelessness, for example. And in these debates, what people argued about was, are people homeless because they had bad luck? You know, their company went bankrupt and they lost their job by bad luck? Or is it that they didn't try, they're lazy and they didn't make an effort? That's what people argued about, the premise. Is it bad luck or is it effort? They didn't argue about what follows from that. Nobody argued about what follows from that. And then people who think it's bad luck, they might propose policies like rent control, thinking that they're helping. But since most of you are economics majors, you probably know that that usually doesn't help. And in fact, there was a study a number of years ago by William Tucker looking at all kinds of variables predicting homelessness in American cities. And the only two that predicted independent variance were the weather. You know, it's much better to be homeless in Santa Monica, California, where it's warm, than in, you know, Minnesota, where it's cold. And rent control, the presence of rent control predicted homelessness because it was shrinking the housing supply. So here's this policy that people are adopting. It seems good to them because it seems like it's going to help homeless people, when in fact it ended up creating more homeless people. In a modern context, you can also ask, what social unit do we interpret as our band? Is it the community, local community? Is it the state? Is it the nation? And this you see in political rhetoric. People will call the band, refer to the nation as a whole as a band when they're advocating government redistribution. People who are against the government redistribution will talk more about the band as their family and their local community. Notice also that when the mind has several different apps, Q-activated programs governing cooperation, political attitudes can change very quickly. And I'm going to give you an example from the work of Lena Aro and Michael Bang-Petersen from Denmark. Perceptions of luck versus effort should trigger they're political scientists, different sharing rules. And some cultural differences that you see may reflect different default assumptions, different stereotypes, rather than different ideologies. And so they compared attitudes towards welfare state, towards redistribution in the Danish welfare state to the United States. And they were able to change Americans into Danes and vice versa. So so if you say nothing about the person receiving welfare, you just say imagine a person who's receiving social welfare and nothing else, then people have different stereotypes of welfare recipients in Denmark and in the United States. In Denmark, they're more likely to think that the person was unlucky, and that's why they're on social welfare. In the US, they're more likely to think the person was lazy, and that's why they're on social welfare. And then then you ask, how opposed are you to social welfare for this person? And what you're seeing is that in America, people are more opposed to it than in Denmark, in a way that tracks their assumptions about whether the person was lazy or unlucky. So what did they do? What happens if you replace the stereotype with information? So the control condition is what I just told you. Then another condition is they said, imagine a man who's currently on social welfare. He's always had a regular job, but has now been the victim of a work-related injury. He's very motivated to get back to work again. And another condition you say, imagine a man who's currently on social welfare. He has never had a regular job, but he's fit and healthy. He's not motivated to get a job. What happens to their opposition to social welfare? What happens is there's no difference between Americans and Danes, regardless of the big difference in the economies. When they're accused that the guy is lazy and he just doesn't want to work, everybody is opposed to giving him social welfare at very high levels. When you have the cues that he's making an effort but he was unlucky, there's much less opposition. And there's no significant difference between Denmark and the United States, despite the differences in the political systems. So to change minds, you need to understand the design of the mind. Policies that might produce the best outcome for the most people may violate evolved intuitions. And as you probably know, often it's free markets that produce the best outcome for the most people, but that may violate a lot of our evolved intuitions. For example, we all think that injury and disease often arise by bad luck. But that doesn't necessarily make socialized medicine the best policy. But to convince people about a policy that your studies have shown is Pareto improving, that's better for most people, you need to understand their and your own evolved intuitions and frame your argument accordingly. Because there's a mismatch between the modern versus the ancestral world. Our minds are equipped with programs that evolved to navigate a small world of relatives, friends, and neighbors, not for cities and nation states of thousands or millions of anonymous people. Certain laws and institutions satisfy the moral intuitions that those programs generate. But because these programs are now operating outside the envelope of environments for which they were designed, laws that satisfy the moral intuitions that satisfy these moral intuitions may regularly fail to produce the outcomes that we're desiring and that we're anticipating. Even worse, they can cause us to overlook policies that have the consequences that we're hoping for. These mental programs so powerfully structure our inferences that certain policies may seem self-evidently correct, and others may seem self-serving or immoral. But modern conditions often produce outcomes that seem very paradoxical to our hunter-gatherer evolved programs. Venal motives can be engines that reliably produce humane outcomes, as Adam Smith was trying to say, and what seem like good intentions can make a hell on earth. So, promote liberty, please. I hope that at this amazing institution that's a value that many of you have acquired. But do it using what you know about human nature. Thanks.